The sitting is resumed. I now call James Arbuthnot.
Ms. Doris, it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I have to say that I'm a bit new to this. In 28 years in the House, I have never before applied for an adjournment debate. I've never needed to apply for an adjournment debate, but the issue of sub-postmasters and the way that the Post Office has treated them, and also now the way the Post Office has treated members of Parliament who were expressing concern about the matter, is so worrying, actually, to my mind, shocking, that in my final few months in Parliament, it has become necessary for me to apply for an adjournment debate. So, to the extent that I make mistakes, Ms. Doris, please correct me and appreciate that I'm new to this game. I'm grateful to honourable and right honourable members for turning up in considerable numbers, which shows the importance of this issue. The background to the issue hardly needs explaining. In 2000, the Post Office introduced the Horizon accounting system, and shortly after that, there began to arise a spate of concerns. Sub-postmasters up and down the country found that they were experiencing discrepancies in the accounts which they had to balance at the end of each day. And some of those accounts were over what they ought to have been, and some were under what they ought to have been. Some sub-postmasters found themselves closing the post offices on a Saturday with one balance and opening on a Monday and discovering that the balance was entirely different. And all of these discrepancies created such a lot of concern that Mr. Alan Bates set up the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance in 2009. And to my mind, the hero of this story is him, because he's been working since 2009 for no pay, and he has been doing a fantastic job. Now, on the Horizon system, the jury is still out on the software itself. But the fact that no software fault of any major size has yet been found does not mean that none exists. And I can give an example, because last week Charles Goodwin, a retired computer programmer, wrote to me to say that collusion and fraud by some unknown third parties could give rise to some of these cases, and he set out in his email to me how that could come about. And I shan't set it out because I don't want to encourage people to do it, but his hypothetical fraud, which fits in with some of the facts in these cases, would be very hard indeed to disprove. And then, if a sub-postmaster who had suffered from this fraud began to complain too loudly, then the fraudsters could simply reimburse that sub-postmaster and move on to another victim instead. And the poor sub-postmaster might have been told, as my constituent, Joe Hamilton, was actually told, that they're the only person suffering from any glitches, so that sub-postmaster is then tempted to help the fraudster by committing false accounting just in order to buy enough time to work out what on earth has happened. Now, I'm not saying that that did happen. It's just that we can't prove it didn't. So, on the software itself, on the possibility of fraud, the jury is still out. But the jury is not still out on the Post Office help system, which was inadequate, as the Post Office acknowledges. Now, I've got two examples in my constituency that I know of. The Post Office is dealing with one of them. And that, I think, reflects the position up and down the country. Other members of Parliament, honourable and right honourable members, will have Some cases that they know of and some cases that they don't. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Peter Stewart.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member giving way. In the case of Haji Abbas, who runs the Chelsea Road Post Office in Edgbaston, his case was investigated. He was found not guilty. His post office was closed. There was an allegation of having lost £90,000. He feels himself he's lost an additional £60,000, and yet the post office is not reopening the branch. So someone has lost their livelihood, unfair allegations, and nothing is being done to redeem that.
Yes.
James Arbuthnot.
I suspect during the course of this debate we will hear all too many stories exactly like that, with awful things happening to sub-postmasters and nothing happening about it. But I've mentioned already Jo Hamilton, my constituent. She pleaded guilty. She had been finding that there was a discrepancy. First, I think it was of £2,000. She rang up the help desk. The help desk told her to press certain buttons, and immediately the discrepancy doubled to £4,000, and eventually it rose, and it got to over £30,000. There was no proper investigation by the Post Office. She told the Today programme last week, they couldn't prove I did it, but I couldn't prove I didn't.
Will my right honourable friend give way?
Certainly I will. Give way to my right honourable friend.
Is it a matter of concern to my right honourable friend, as indeed it is to me, that all the Post Office prosecutions have been conducted in-house, and that the Crown Prosecution Service has not been consulted, and therefore there has been no independent element of scrutiny prior to the prosecution's commencement?
James Arbuthnot.
My right honourable friend was the instigator of the first meeting I had with the Post Office. It was during the last Parliament. And then, unfortunately, he was translated to become a cabinet minister, and so he was unable to pursue these issues in the way that he had been doing before. But my right honourable friend is absolutely right in putting his finger on that point, and I will come back to that in some of the suggestions that I hope that the minister will look at when she comes to wind up. I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
Oliver Heald.
Right honourable friend for giving way. The conundrum one of my constituents had is slightly different in that she was prosecuted and found guilty. Her claim is that this is totally unfair and wrong. But she put into the scheme just too late for the deadline. And now, of course, she's being offered a review by the Post Office, but she's not very confident that they'll do a thorough review. And so I wonder if my right honourable friend has any thoughts on that. Shouldn't it be possible, if it's only a short period after the deadline, that she would go into the scheme?
James Arbuthnot.
Well, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I would have given a different answer to this question to my right honourable friend. I no longer have faith in the scheme, I'm afraid. And so whether or not she wishes to be in a scheme which she may or may not have faith in, I think has to be up to her. But certainly I believe that the Post Office should not have an arbitrary cut-off point as to when they examine these issues of injustice. And I hope that my right honourable friend, in fact I'm sure, I know that my right honourable friend will continue to pursue this issue. Certainly I will.
Pursuant to that very point, I have 3 cases in my small constituency that are outside of the mediation scheme, but many of those, and I myself, had placed faith that the mediation scheme would progress well and would give us some hope that at some point there would be a silver lining for us who were outside of it. It seems that, understandably, his lack of faith in that now has meant that there is no avenue open for the many, I suspect, who were outside of that initial mediation scheme.
James Arbuthnot.
The honourable gentleman was intending to have an adjournment debate, and I'm very sorry that I pinched his idea and did it instead, but I'm grateful to him for his support in these issues, because he's been raising these points now for some time. But we must get to the bottom of these cases, and we cannot, I'm afraid, rely on the Post Office alone to see right. My honourable, the constituent I have, Jo Hamilton, pleaded guilty. She had a choice between risking prison for theft or pleading guilty to false accounting. And she decided that that risk was too great, and I don't believe that that is the way in which our criminal law should work. The village in which she lives, South Warnborough, didn't believe she was a crook any more than I do, and they paid thousands of pounds towards the money that the post office was demanding. And there was another sub-postmaster who gave an interview to Radio 5 Live last week, Julian Wilson of Astwood Bank. He had a similar story. His wife was convalescing from a tumour. Her father had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. He didn't want to put his family under the strain that it would all cause, so he pleaded guilty to false accounting in order to avoid the accusation of theft. And he now, like Jo Hamilton, has a criminal conviction. Noel Thomas of Anglesey, and it's very good to see the honourable member for Anglesey in his place, was found guilty of theft and sent to prison, and so were many others up and down the country. And it may, of course, be that the trade of sub-postmastering was infiltrated by a sudden rash of criminals. But I've met a lot of these people, and I personally don't believe it. So, certainly I will.
Andrew Bridgen.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And would he confirm that the Post Office have the ability to bring criminal prosecutions which have already gone to the CPS, which the CPS believe there is insufficient grounds for a prosecution? Will he confirm that?
Yes, as my honourable friend suggests, and as my right honourable friend suggested before, I think it is becoming increasingly untenable for the Post Office to act as its own prosecutor without the independent look that the Crown Prosecution Service would bring. My impression is that the Post Office actually shares that view. And so the sooner that they can get rid of that responsibility to prosecute, I believe it should be today, the better. And so in the light of all of these cases, members of Parliament got together. My right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, and I went to see the chairman and the chief executive of the Post Office, and they then came to meet honourable and right honourable members. And they suggested that they should set up an independent forensic investigation. And they appointed Second Sight to do this work. And as a result of that, what then happened was that Second Sight identified certain concerns which gave rise to the mediation scheme that we're discussing today. In the interim report by Second Sight did not identify major software issues. And so it must follow that the mediation scheme was set up to deal with the issues of support and surrounding issues relating to the sub-postmasters. And the Post Office therefore agreed to a mediation scheme which was to include those who had pleaded guilty. I mean, it's almost too obvious to mention, but in view of what the Post Office has been doing, I have to do so. I would never have agreed to a mediation scheme which had excluded someone like Jo Hamilton, who had pleaded guilty. She was my constituent. I wouldn't have agreed to one, and neither would honourable and right honourable members throughout the House. So that's what they agreed. And now let's look at what they actually did. In the working group of the mediation scheme, the Post Office began this year to argue that issues of concern which had been identified by Second Sight should be excluded from mediation. For example, the absence or ignorance of contracts, the failure of audits and investigations. And this was despite the agreement that they'd had with members of Parliament that the scheme was there to cover the issues in the interim report. And in recent months, I understand that the Post Office has been arguing at the working group stage to exclude 90% of the cases coming before the working group. And this was despite everybody's understanding that exclusion from mediation was to be the exception and not the rule. The Post Office has argued, extraordinarily, to exclude those who had pleaded guilty. And they've been arguing that on the grounds that they've been pleading guilty, despite their agreement expressly to the contrary with me and with honourable and right honourable members, despite the fact that they knew that we would never have agreed to a mediation scheme. They didn't have... Certainly, I will give way
John
to
Radwood.
my right honourable friend.
Very grateful to my right honourable friend. I'm very grateful to him for leading on this issue and bravely taking the case of many people from the postal area to the management. Is there any sign in his discussions with the senior management of the Post Office that they now recognise they did make some mistakes? Is there any willingness on their part to recognise that at least some of these people are completely innocent and deserve an apology and compensation for the way their lives and businesses have been wrecked?
James Arbuthnot.
Very difficult question to answer, because the Post Office pleads secrecy. The Post Office won't tell us what is happening in this mediation scheme, so that when we discovered that we asked in July how the mediation scheme was going, and the Post Office refused to tell members of Parliament because it was all confidential. Yes, I will.
Jonathan Chinoglu.
Giving way. And can I also congratulate him on calling this debate and indeed the huge amount of work he's done on this over many years. Unfortunately, this saga has seriously affected the reputation of one of my constituents. I use the word saga because what I find so unacceptable here, and I think my right honourable friend was just coming on to this, was the delay involved in all of this. Just the year upon year upon year with people's reputations on the line, with people, Subpostmasters, not knowing what their status or position is or how this issue is progressing. And I find the foot dragging and inefficiency and years of delay of the Post Office to be absolutely unacceptable.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. And when people are having their houses repossessed, time really matters to them. And this is happening throughout the country. So the Post Office has been arguing that these cases should be excluded. They've been doing it at a stage of the process when there is not the professional representation in front of the working group, because there are no professional advisors in front of the work. Even the sub-postmaster is not in front of the working group when the Post Office is arguing that they should be excluded from mediation. Despite the Post Office therefore heralding the payment of professional support for all these sub-postmasters, in practice it's a sham. And they're doing this in the interests of the integrity of the scheme. What are the conclusions that we have to reach, therefore? The Post Office has built up the hopes of sub-postmasters that the scheme should have their support. And they have broken their word to members of Parliament in so many different respects that it is frankly bewildering. There are many ways to describe it, but I think that the best word is that the Post Office has been duplicitous. They've spent money, public money, on a mediation scheme which they themselves have set out to sabotage. And in the Today programme interview last week, the Post Office spokesman said, "I am really sorry if people have faced lifestyle problems as a result of their having been working in Post Office branches. These aren't lifestyle problems." Jo Hamilton had to get help from her parents as well as from her village. Her mother and her father then both had a stroke. Was that connected? I suspect it was. Some sub-postmasters lost their businesses, their houses, their reputations. Some had divorces and lost their families. Some had to live in their cars. Some had health problems. Noel Thomas and others went to prison. And these aren't lifestyle problems. And the Post Office spokesman also said that it's not yet over. Well, if it were up to the Post Office, it would be. They're trying to close it down. And for some who've been through mediation, it is actually over, because they have experienced legal bullying and no intention by the Post Office to get to the bottom of what went wrong. Documents have been destroyed or lost. Certainly I will.
Anna Brooks. I do thank you, and I also congratulate my right honourable friend for the enormous amount of work that he's done on this matter. I also have this concern about the length of time involved and the lack of information. The mediation requires information on both sides, and my constituents make the point that they've requested audit trails and they just haven't been given those, which really does seem to be exactly what my right honourable friend's saying at the moment, and I wonder if he would confirm that that's been fairly widespread, not getting the essential information to actually be able to defend themselves.
James Arbuthnot.
Well, yes, it has, and my honourable friend has been working on this issue since the very beginning. And I can... Obviously, constituency cases are confidential to constituency MPs. All I can say is that my own constituent, Jo Hamilton, has been told that she can't have a result until after Second Sight have produced their report in April. I first became concerned about her case in 2008, and this sort of time lapse is utterly unacceptable. Not only is the Post Office doing this in breach of their word to members of Parliament and in breach of their duties to the people they work with, the sub-postmasters, they're undermining and belittling the work of the forensic accountants whom they chose. And it's the independence of these accountants, which I have to say, members of Parliament at first questioned, but which we now really welcome, which I think the Post Office finds hard to take. The Post Office has accepted that their support systems left much to be desired, and as a result, they have changed them. If you look at the sheer number of calls to the Post Office helpline, it is astonishing. And these people are professional users. But there were tens of thousands of helpline calls which were abandoned, not just made, but were abandoned. And Jo Hamilton was faced with support staff who couldn't tell her what was going on. She had not been trained at all, let alone to deal with issues like this. And what has the Post Office done about the absence of training which she received? They have blamed her. They blamed her and others like her for not having asked for more training, despite the fact that it should have been clear, yes I will, it should have been clear to the Post Office if it wasn't clear to her that she needed it. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Have they indeed not done more than that? Because as late as November the 24th, is it not the case that the Post Office have announced that a quarter of the staff that provide advice and support to sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses are going to be made redundant, reduced by the middle of February? So the very poor service that sub-postmasters can draw on at present is to be reduced by the Post Office by 25%.
James Arbuthnot.
My understanding is something like that, but I hope that the Honourable Gentleman, who's been a key member of the working group of members of Parliament, will be able to expand on that when he speaks, because I don't know the full detail of that. The Post Office carried out no proper investigation in what happened to Jo Hamilton. Julian Wilson of the Redditch constituency was told by Post Office staff that if there was money over at the end of the day, he should put it in an envelope and put that in the safe. And then he should use that money to pay later shortfalls. Well, it is so obvious that that amounts to false accounting at the instructions of the Post Office. It's bewildering. He kept asking for audits, yet the Post Office said, we'll audit you when we think you need an audit. Yet he gets prosecuted and he decides to plead guilty. So what allowance has been made by the Post Office for the fact that historically their support was so poor? So far as I can tell, none. What allowance has been made for the contract term which provides that the weakest links in the Post Office, the Subpostmasters, have to be found guilty unless they prove their innocence? So far as I can tell, none. This is not the way our criminal law should work. What has happened to the money which the Post Office got from people like Joe Hamilton via the South Warnborough village? Did it get taken into Post Office profits? This is essentially an issue of Post Office culture, the protection of assets at the expense of people. Certainly, I will give way.
Oliver
I'm
Heald.
grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. If there are problems with the software, or if there is a vulnerability of the system to hacking of the sort my right honourable friend has described, surely the Post Office would have taken steps to improve the software and or make sure that it was more difficult to hack their system. Is there any evidence that they did that? And if they did, isn't that an admission in itself that the system was vulnerable and that mistakes could have been made?
James Arbuthnot.
Well, my honourable friend makes an interesting point. The thing that I am worried about most is that it is often impossible to find those flaws in the software that could have caused some of these problems. And Second Sight's interim report did not find major problems with the software. But as I said at the beginning, that doesn't mean that those problems did not exist. The Post Office's behaviour to members of Parliament gives, to my mind, some credence to the complaints that have been made by sub-postmasters about the behaviour of the Post Office to them. If they can treat members of Parliament like that, how will they deal with people who are frightened and bankrupt? Somehow, in all of this saga, the Post Office has managed, it would be hard to think it would be possible, to tarnish its own reputation still further, while again tarnishing the reputation of sub-postmasters. Now, I have, as honourable and right honourable members know, handed on the mantle of this campaign to the honourable member for North Durham, and I'm very pleased to see him in his place. It's partly because I shan't be standing in the general election next year, but it's also because, frankly, I no longer trust them, and I shan't be negotiating with them further. I did not, as some of the newspaper reports suggested, withdraw the support of 150 members of Parliament, because I got no right to do that. I withdrew my own personal support, and what honourable and right honourable members do now is, of course, up to them, but I believe that there are other avenues that need to be taken. I think we need a review by the government, because we own this organisation. It has to be entirely independent of the Post Office, which has shown that it cannot be trusted in the issue. Possibly it's an issue of a special ombudsman. In my letter to the Chief Executive of the Post Office, I asked for three things. I asked for no further destruction of documents, and by documentation I really mean not only the documentation for those who are within the mediation scheme, but also the documentation for those cases, for those honourable members and right honourable members who haven't managed, for one reason or another, to get into the mediation scheme. And they have been mentioned already. I hope that the government can prevent the Post Office pleading the statute of limitations so that sub-postmasters' legal actions should not be time-barred by the passage of time, some of them caused by the behaviour of the Post Office. And I hope that the Post Office and the government can agree that honourable and right honourable members should be briefed by second sight on, not on individual cases, but on the way the mediation scheme has gone. Now, I wrote a letter to the Post Office at the beginning of last week asking for these things, but I have had no response. And certainly I can wait for my honourable friend.
Councillor Munt.
For giving way. I wondered if he's already referred to the fact that evidence that's been needed to investigate complaints raised by the applicants shouldn't be destroyed, but I wondered whether the honourable gentleman might, in his position as leader of this debate, actually make sure that the Minister asks that the Post Office guarantees that the material that's been gathered and produced by Second Sight actually remains in Second Sight's possession, and that control of it cannot be destroyed if or when the Post Office instructs Second Sight to do just that.
My honourable friend makes a very interesting and very worthwhile point, and I hope that Second Sight will indeed have a role to play. They are meant to be independent. That was what my honourable friend the Minister described them as in the statement of last year, and I hope that their approach to documents will be equally independent. I hope that the Minister will be able to assure us of that. It may be that there is a role for the Select Committee on Business, Innovation and Skills, and I'm very pleased that the honourable member, the chairman of that committee, has been in his place today. There should be an investigation by the Criminal Cases Review Commission off its own bat, and even those who have pleaded guilty should be able to take advantage of such an investigation, and there will be a role for the courts. And I think, therefore, there will need to be a fund to help sub-postmasters in those actions. It would be good to think that the Post Office itself could, of its own accord, modify its own behaviour. I wish I did think that, but I don't.
I will be calling the front benches to speak at 15:40. There are quite a few of you indicating you'd like to speak now. So I'll let you do the maths between yourselves. Although, obviously, if time moves on and we're running, I will then have to impose time limits on the people who are left. So I'll leave it to you to use your discretion at the moment. Albert Owen.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Gentleman, and I just want to put on record what other members have said, and to congratulate him and his office for the way that they've dealt with other MPs during this whole process. He and his office have been very measured, very courteous in the way that they've dealt with us, and it brought together a groundswell of opinion from MPs and was able to put that in a very articulated fashion to the Post Office. And I share his disappointment at the way the Post Office has behaved, because I was one of those members that welcomed initially a mediation process, because a mediation process is a process of goodwill where both sides volunteer to come together to look for a solution. And what we've been talking about in this debate today is the destruction of many people's lives, many citizens who are well thought of in their communities. The Right Honourable Gentleman mentioned Noel Thomas in my constituency. Noel Thomas was a councillor, not of my political persuasion, but he was a councillor in that community who did more than his fair share of good for people. And he ended up in prison because of this system and because of the way that I believe, and I'm speaking personally here, he has been let down by the Post Office. The early stages where legal matters, and I and other members allowed that legal process to go forward. And it wasn't until the group was set up, the Justice Subpostmasters Alliance, that the wider issues were known. And I pay tribute to each and every one of them for coming together, for fighting for what they believe to be right. My constituent Noel Thomas ended up in prison. Very serious issues there. Lost his home, his business, and the impact that the Right Honourable Gentleman said on his constituents was felt on many of my constituents. And I have a very small constituency, and I know of 5 cases in my constituency of different varying degrees. But his is the most public, and he's the only person that I will name. in this debate, but I have a number of others. The Horizon system itself has been looked at, and I want to argue in my contribution that there has been problems with that system, because many sub-postmasters and mistresses, some of them who are now retired, post offices have closed for whatever reason, had indicated to me in the early stages of 2001-2 that there was problems in rural areas when the system was going offline, and it was rebooted, and there was issues there of concern at that time. So I find it very hard that the Post Office come to a conclusion that there's nothing wrong with the system. And I'll come a little bit later to the lack of support that's been given and helplines, because it was very important. And the Right Honourable Gentleman mentioned, and I heard this on the radio as well, of being told by Post Office staff, many sub-postmasters, to put money aside and to make it up. And again, you know, that beggars belief that some people, there's no evidence of it in many places, because of that trust between Post Office as the employer and the sub-postmasters who are running their thing. I'll give way to the Right Honourable Gentleman.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. And does he not agree with me that a lot of these sub-postmasters who were subsequently prosecuted for false accounting had, in effect, been encouraged to engage in false accounting by the Post Office support staff? In other words, were not the Post Office themselves counselling and procuring an act of false accounting?
Absolutely right. And I thought that this system and this scheme was going to identify those issues, and that somebody in the Post Office was going to have to answer for their actions in the way that our constituents have had to answer by going to prison and by losing their livelihoods and various things. So it's been very one-sided. And another case that I had of a relatively young woman whose life has been ruined because of the accusations. She, through the advice of a barrister, pleaded guilty to the lesser charge to avoid a custodial sentence. So she felt that now that she'd been let down by not just the Post Office, but by the legal system itself. And these are very serious issues. And members of Parliament across the House have indicated to me that they have similar cases in the way that this has been handled. And I thought that this process, reading the correspondence that I've had from other MPs and various things, that this was an independent process. I now am led to believe that the Post Office was judge and jury, and it was deciding unilaterally which cases were to go forward. And again, I agree totally with the Right Honourable Gentleman that I was of the opinion that people who had been found guilty for the reasons that we've outlined would be allowed to enter that system of mediation. So I'm very disappointed with the way that this is turning out, because we are talking about, and I'll repeat this on a number of occasions, we're talking about people's lives that have been ruined by this process. And I was under the impression that we were moving forward and that we were making progress. A third case of a constituent of mine who entered the scheme was helped by the Post Office, who, as we all know, paid for the early advice that that person was given. And because that person's status moved from being a sub-postmaster to an employee of another sub-postmaster, they were thrown off the scheme. But that was discovered at a later stage. Although taxpayers' money had been given to a third party to help that person to give advice to come to that conclusion, a complete waste of public money in the process. Now, I argued the case on behalf of my constituents, and he was reinstated into the scheme and is moving forward. But because of confidentiality, I don't really know where that case is in the system as we speak now. So there is a lot of issues that need clarification. And I do have sympathy with the Minister here, because Post Office itself, as we know, is not a directly government body. But it is a public body that we, the taxpayers, and us as representatives, should hold to account. And that's why I pay tribute to the Right Honourable Gentleman and others for doing that. I won't go over the other cases that I've got, but it gives an example, and I've heard interventions today, and I'm conscious of time. But I feel let down by the Post Office. My constituents feel let down by the Post Office, and I think the country feels let down by Post Office. And I want to repeat that I have anecdotal evidence, not hard evidence, that this system was problematic. And computer systems are. IT systems across government and across public body on a large scale have problems. But the reason why the Post Office won't admit to these glitches, won't admit to it, because as we've all indicated in interventions, and I'm sure will in future speeches, that they were encouraged to do practices which were, in many ways, unlawful. And that is a disgrace. And I think that is the crux of this debate. The Post Office themselves were encouraging people to do false accounting and then penalising them with the hardest way possible by taking their livelihood away from them, their reputation away from them, destroying their standing in the communities, proud communities that we represent. The Post Office is iconic. People who serve in it do so with pride. They have been let down, and it's time this Parliament, the British Parliament, stood up for those people, and I'm glad we're having this debate today, and I want some results in the future.
Well done, well done.
6 minutes. And Mr Bridgen next. If I could just say if we could keep the speeches now to 6 minutes without me having to impose a formal time limit, because we are unfortunately going to run out of time. Mr Bridgen.
It's a great pleasure to serve on you, even if as briefly as 6 minutes on this huge topic. I'll start by adding my tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for North East Hampshire, for his leadership on this over many years. It's been an honour and a privilege to serve under him on his working group of MPs for the last 2 years. This issue first came to my attention because of my constituent's plight, Mr Michael Rudkin, a man who'd for 15 years been a sub-postmaster and served as the most senior member on the National Executive and Chairman of the Negotiating Committee for sub-postmasters, responsible for negotiations with Post Office Limited and Royal Mail Group. So he's a very experienced sub-postmaster. I'd like to share his experience of the Horizon system and problems around it. And I think his case will demonstrate some very, very strong questions that need to be asked of the Post Office, which they are very reluctant to answer. His story started on the 19th of August 2008, when in his official capacity, negotiating on behalf of sub-postmasters, he was invited to a meeting to discuss problems with the Horizon system at the Fujitsu Post Office Limited offices in Bracknell. This was on Tuesday the 19th of August 2008, as I said. And the following sequence of events demonstrates, if Mr Rudkin's telling the truth, which I have no doubt to believe he is, questions that the Post Office has to answer about the system. My constituent states, on my arrival that morning, he signed the visitor's book at the reception area and waited for his chaperone, Mr Martin Rolfe. Mr Rolfe took him to the third floor of the building. They entered a suite with what Mr Rudkin clearly recognised as Horizon equipment on the benches. My constituent states that there were only one other person present in the room, a male approximately 30 or 35, and he was very reluctant to engage in conversation with either himself or Mr Rolfe. Mr Rolfe asked Mr Rudkin, my constituent, to follow him through a number of passcard protected security doors to a stairs where they descended down to the ground floor and then entered the boiler room. Mr Rudkin states that a number of men dressed in casual office wear were stood around the doorway. They became very uncomfortable about Mr Rudkin's presence and left. Having entered the boiler room, Mr Rudkin instantly recognised 2 Horizon terminals with data on both screens and an operative sat in front of one of the terminals where the pure feed for the Horizon system came into the building. Mr Rudkin then states that he asked if this was real-time data available on the system, and he and Mr Rolfe said yes. And I can actually alter a Bureau de Change figure to demonstrate that this is live. So he was going to alter a figure in a sub-postmaster's account. He then laughed and said, I'll have to put it back, otherwise the sub-postmaster's account will be short tonight. Mr Rudkin expressed his deep concern because he had been told that no one has access remotely to a post office sub-postmaster's account. Upon this, Mr Rudkin was politely but speedily taken to reception and told to leave the building. Mysteriously, on the next day, Wednesday the 20th of August 2008, a Post Office Limited auditor arrived at his sub-post office, and a gentleman Mr Rudkin knew by the name of Paul Fields, and he proceeded to tell Mr Rudkin that his post office branch had a loss of £44,000. It's interesting that Mr Rudkin maintains that the investigator knew the size of the loss before he even entered the premises. Mr Rudkin was absolved of all knowledge of the loss by Post Office Limited and ordered to pay it back at £1,000 a month from his salary, because we've already heard that under the contracts, the sub-postmaster is completely liable for all losses. And as Mr Rudkin points out, when you know that, why would you ever steal money from yourself? Having paid £13,000 back to Post Office Limited, the Post Office then started proceedings against Mrs Rudkin, Mr Rudkin's wife, for false accounting. They also applied for a confiscation order, placed all of his property, and had his bank account frozen on using the Proceeds of Crime Act. Mr Rudkin has since cleared all his debts to Poll, and in the process has lost his business, his reputation, his position as a magistrate, some property, his good name, and he's never been able to work since. At Second Sight, the team of independent investigators appointed by the Post Office to look into this, have questioned the Post Office about Mr Rudkin's allegations and his visit. Initially, Post Office Limited consistently denied that the visit had ever taken place. That is until Mr Rudkin produced an email from Mr Rolfe the day before, inviting him and saying, "I'll meet you in reception." Then the Post Office did admit that the meeting took place. Second Sight have repeatedly requested email data before, during and after the visit by Mr Rudkin, and also a copy of the visitor's book. All of these documents have either been withheld or have been told are now missing. This asks serious questions about the Post Office. Second Sight have also told me that they've looked at the contract that sub-postmaster asked to sign, and in their view, you'd have to be an economic and legal illiterate to be willing to sign such a contract, because the contract is so slanted in favour of the Post Office. And as we know, the Horizon system is imposed upon sub-postmasters by the Post Office. Effectively, the sub-postmasters in all this become the fall guy. They are ultimately liable for all losses. So there is very little incentive for the Post Office to ensure that the Horizon system is robust, or the support for that system is robust. I think the way that our working group of MPs has been dealt with by the Post Office senior management is extremely high-handed. I do share my right honourable friend's concerns. If they speak to cabinet members and senior members of Parliament in the way they do, the way they must treat their own sub-postmasters, it's basically feudal. I will, Ms Doris. There are many questions to be answered, and I do hope that under this parliamentary pressure and debates as this, we will get the Post Office to move to a position where genuine negotiations will take place with aggrieved parties on a level playing field. We're some way away from that yet. And I quite honestly think that we're going to need a full clear out of the Post Office management before we're going to get that change of attitude in this very important public institution.
Mike Wood.
Very pleased to be called in this important debate, and I'd like to place on record too my thanks to the right honourable member from North East Hampshire, who has tried valiantly over the last 2 to 3 years to bring the Post Office to a position where it would do the honourable thing in regard to sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses who have been slighted by this scheme. All it would appear to no avail. But nonetheless, I think we should place on record our thanks to him for his valiant efforts. Yeah. Central to this issue and central to the operations of all 11,500 sub-post offices in this country is the Horizon system. We have to remember it's a very ancient system. It was second-hand when the Post Office took it on between 1996 and 2000. It was designed for other purposes anyway. And in IT terms, 18, 20 years down the road, it's a dinosaur. And if you add to that the problems that are inherent in all large-scale IT systems, when you bolt things on, when you make updates, when you expect it to interface with other systems that it was never designed to interface with, patently we have a very flawed and degraded and deteriorating system that is the central feature in the activity. 60 million transactions a year or thereabouts that this accounts for, central to the issue that we're looking at today. But its influence, you might say its malevolent influence on the lives of sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses is added to, in my view, by two features and two things. One, the relationship between Post Office Limited and its sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses, and the attitude of Post Office Limited senior staff. Sub-postmasters and mistresses are bound in their relationship with the Post Office by a contract which has been described as Dickensian, but I think even our Victorian forebears would be struggling to justify a contract, 114 pages long, all of it in the usual small print, first put together in 1994, which essentially places all responsibility for problems and shortcomings of Post Office Limited's own equipment and own system. So the responsibility for any problem, any shortfall, any shortcoming, contractually rests with the postmaster or the postmistress. As the last speaker said, that of course removes any compunction apparently on Post Office Limited to do anything about a very flawed system, although one which it does appear that they've had the ability to bolt on a facility which means that it can remotely alter the figures from an individual post office after they've been signed off for the day by the postmaster or postmistress that is responsible for those figures. So it's a very flawed system, but it's a system they've used, apparently, to very good effect. And if you back up this very flawed and ancient system with very poor and often non-existent training and support, we have the recipe for a disaster. But the disaster we have to remember is not the post office in the short term, it's for those postmasters and postmistresses who get caught out by glitches and failings in the system, and which have been illustrated earlier, and I've no need to repeat further examples. But the second issue is this attitude from Post Office Limited's management. The two members of this committee today who were present, as I was, when we met the 5 senior managers of Post Office Limited, the chair of the board, the chief executive, the chief technical officer, and 2 others, who said, we cannot conceive of there being failings in our Horizon system. You cannot conceive. I went round all 5. You cannot conceive of a flaw in our system. Now, first of all, it makes you wonder which planet they live on. But secondly, we know, therefore, if the premise from which the organisation is operating is that there are no problems. Uniquely, we have a computer system with which there are no problems, can be no problems, then it explains some of the way they behave further down the line when, for instance, their investigation department should be renamed. It's never done an investigation since it was set up. What it has done when problems have been found is eventually to go to the individual postmaster and postmistress and say, there's a problem here. Patently, it's not our system. It's faultless. It must be you. So perhaps now, under caution, because of course they have this ability to prosecute, under caution, without you having legal representation here, what we'd like you to do is to sign a statement here that you have taken part in false accounting, and then we'll think about not prosecuting. People, of course, under those circumstances, often knowing that there's been a problem, often encouraged by the advice and support team, well, it'll sort itself out. Don't worry about it, is the advice a lot of people give. Put it in an envelope and keep it for later and sort it out later. So following that advice, find themselves, yes, of course, that's false accounting. I'll sign the statement.
6 minutes now, so if you could speed
Right,
up.
OK. So what we need, I think, is to be looking to the future. But what we must have, and in, bearing out what's been said by the previous speaker about the removal of this very poor senior management in Post Office Limited, we must have justice for the postmasters and postmistresses, hundreds of whom have had their lives ruined by this very flawed system.
Katie Clark.
My much, Mrs Doris, and it's a pleasure to see you in the chair today and to congratulate the Right Honourable Gentleman for all the work that he's done in this issue and indeed securing what I understand is his first adjournment debate today. I would like to make reference to my entry in the Register of Interests and to advise the House that I'm chair of the Communications Workers group, and I've had quite a wide range of discussions with them, and in particular the CW Postmasters branch, who've had a number of members affected by the issues which have been raised today. As I think has already been made very clear in the debate that we've had so far, this is an issue that has been ongoing for many, many years. And I would like to reiterate one of the points made by my honourable friend for Batley and Spen, that one of the issues that I think has come across very clearly to me in my discussions with sub-postmasters and mistresses is the denial which seems to exist from the Post Office that there is a problem. And the way that that is experienced by those who are directly affected is that if there is a loss, if there is a problem that occurs in relation to the finances, the initial response of the Post Office is that it is the postmaster or mistress that is blamed, rather than a serious inquiry to see if there's a fault in the system or to find out what has gone wrong. And that obviously is absolutely devastating for the individuals involved, who, as already has been shown, often have to go through years of anguish as a result of problems of this nature. The Communication Workers Union itself is supporting a number of members who are waiting for their cases to be heard as part of the mediation service. And indeed, one of the members that they have been supporting has been suspended without pay for over a year, waiting for his case to be heard by the mediation scheme. Another has increasing level of losses hanging over him for more than 8 months now, and that's despite the fact that there has been an ongoing involvement with the Post Office, with technical staff coming to see what the cause of losses are and trying to find why there's losses and whether there's gains. The Communication Workers Union itself gets involved with postmasters and postmistresses who are seeking help with the computer system on a regular basis. And that's not necessarily individuals who are being accused of anything, but simply individuals who are having problems with the system. Because as workers, they find that they have numerous problems with the system which is operating, and some of the reasons for that have already been highlighted in the debate. And the general point that comes through is that the support systems provided by the support people at the Post Office are inadequate, with wrong advice and assistance regularly being given by the help desks that exist to try and deal with these situations as they arise. And indeed, I'm advised that the technical help desk, which is crucial to identifying solutions when problems arrive, is actually based in the Philippines. So, as well as all the other problems, I'm advised that one of the significant problems is language difficulties when it's being attempted to actually sort out technical problems. So I would ask that the Minister look at that. We've already heard in the debate already of the job losses which are threatened, and it's very clear that the support that exists at the moment is inadequate, and I hope that the Minister will look at that when she responds to this debate. So the main concern that's coming through from those that are directly affected is that there doesn't seem to be a fair and open process to deal with a postmaster or postmistress where it's believed that there might be some kind of responsibility for a shortage in the accounts. And as a union, the Communication Worker Union are regularly involved in these issues, even when it doesn't actually amount to the kind of serious problems that have been identified in some of the contributions that we've already had in this debate today. The Communications Workers branch advised me that they've seen the Relief report that's been issued by the forensic investigator's second sight. And I understand that that report has indeed been seen by many journalists and indeed by many members of the House. But I think one of the concerns is the lack of public scrutiny and the fact that these issues aren't in the public domain, because it does seem that the contingent liabilities and the amounts of money that are involved over many years are really quite significant, and that is highlighted in the report. Yet that's something that isn't officially in the public domain, and indeed does not appear in any way in the annual reports and accounts that the Post Office has to publish. So what I would say to the Minister is that there does need to be a far higher level of transparency about the problem that exists, because it is public money that we are dealing with. The people that I've spoken to that have got experience of the system accept much of what is in the Second Sight report, and their view is that it isn't that there's one single fault with the system, but there are dozens and dozens of things which, when you step back and consider the system as a whole, are potentially the problem. But the major cultural problem that we seem to have is that the initial response from this Post Office, despite everything that we've heard today and all the representations that have been made over many years, is that if there does seem to be a problem, the initial response is that the individual is responsible. And I think that's the cultural problem that I hope that the Minister will look at very, very seriously, because it's quite clear that we do have a very significant problem here. Exactly the reason why there's all these problems within the system is something that perhaps nobody is fully clear about, but all the evidence is that there's an extremely significant problem. It's resulting in very low morale for those working in the system, and it is a matter that I hope that the Minister will respond on fully today.
Kevin Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Norrie. Can I first of all congratulate my right honourable friend for Northampton for securing this debate. The Post Office spokesman on the Today programme described that some postmistresses and postmasters have had lifestyle issues with this issue. Can I just explain what it's meant for Tom Brown, my constituents in Stanley in North Durham? He's lost his home, investment property owned, he's been declared bankrupt, he now lives with his son, his reputation has been dragged through the mud, and he's lost in excess of £250,000. This is someone who's actually been a sub-postmaster for nearly 30 years. Someone who's actually been held up at gunpoint on 5 different occasions. Now, in 2008, he actually informed the Post Office that there was a problem with the system, something which I know many other postmistresses and masters did. And he was told, no problems, it will be sorted out. At the next audit, he was accused of stealing £82,000. He was arrested by the police, and his home was searched, his car was searched, looking for this. And even though he was explained to the Post Office about the problems that had arisen. The police interviewed him. His reputation, as I say, was dragged through the mud. And like my honourable friend Mangles, he said, these people who are known in their local community, so you're not going to be arrested quietly without any publicity. The police dropped the case. There was no evidence to answer. The pernicious side of it then was the Post Office took him to court, accusing him of 2 charges of false accounting under the powers which they had. It took until July of 2013 for that to get to court. When it got to court, the Post Office offered no evidence whatsoever, and the case was thrown out at that stage. Now, I have a question to ask the Minister, is whether she could actually say what was the decision process, and why was the actual Post Office pursuing prosecutions when clearly the police had looked at some of these and they found that there was no case to answer, that they actually then put these people through further agony of actually threatening them with court action, even though when they got to court there was no action taken because they had no evidence. Now, Mr Brown is now in the mediation service, and he's got a date in the new year. His solicitors advised him, quite rightly in my opinion, to continue his legal action against the Post Office because, like the honourable member for North East Hampshire, I think the mediation system is a bit of a joke. And I've got to say, the arrogant way in which the Post Office are dealing with this is actually astounding. And just before the debate started, the Minister's PPS passed a letter round from the working group on the mediation system. And I've got to say, what an arrogant way to address a minister, saying, I am limited what information I can give you because the scheme requires a great deal of, the cases do be treated confidentiality. Who do the Post Office actually answer to? And that is a fundamental point. Now, this is a national scandal. The idea that over 150 individual sub-postmasters and mistresses who have worked tirelessly in their local community for decades, in some cases, have suddenly all worked out that they can actually defraud the system is complete and utter nonsense. Now, we've seen the scandal in the banking system of way in which LIBOR fines have been rigged and others. Those bankers have basically been slapped on the wrist and asked to pay a fine. These individuals have not only had money, their reputations sullied, they've actually been dragged through the courts in some cases, put in prison, and others, like Mr Tom Brown, my constituent's, life completely ruined. Now, I'm sorry I've got to say this to the Minister, it is now time for action. Now, I have been a Minister, and I know when you get a lot of flannel from your civil servants saying what you can and cannot do. But can I just give her a word of advice? If she's determined enough to actually get this sorted out, she can do it. And I think what we need out of this debate today is a clear commitment from her to actually get the Post Office to not only admit the mistakes they've made, but actually get this scandal sorted out. Because people's lives have been ruined. Decent, honest, hard-working people. And that is just not fair. If it happened in any other area of life, I'm sure that this would have been a national scandal. It is a national scandal, in my opinion, and I'm looking certainly to her to ensure that she can get something done. And if her civil servants come back and say she can't do X, Y and Z, just keep challenging them.
Davis.
Thank you, Mrs Doris. In the short time available, I want to first of all thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his hard work and those involved with his group there. And I'm dismayed by the fact that he and many of them now have lost faith, because my sub-postmasters who were outside of that scheme were very much pinning their hopes on some successful outcome that could point a way forward for them. They now feel exceptionally let down as well. But let me say, first of all, sub-postmasters have been hung out to dry on this. They're either being accused, quite simply, Mrs Doris, of mass fraud, of being rogues, or of mass stupidity, of being fools. Now, I'm not naive enough to believe that there aren't some rogues out there, and that there might be some fools out there. There are enough in this place. Even families have them as well. But the idea that there is now mass criminality, or mass fraud, or mass stupidity, or mass ineptitude, or mass deception going on, worthy of some sort of criminal fraternity like Smersh or Spectre in James Bond, or some society of clowns who can't even add up. Although before Horizon they certainly could, there were no problems before that, I think just stretches the bounds of imagination. I want to turn to one particular case of three in mind. But first of all, let me just say, in response to some of the points made, all but three of my sub-postmasters are deemed rural in my constituency of Ogmore. I have three cases in a very small constituency. All of them say consistently things. They're very different in their individual nature, but all of them say they've all had problems with the interface between Horizon and existing schemes. They've all had problems with downtime on Horizon during the period it was being introduced, which has messed up their calculations, and the lack of support and training given when that happened was appalling. They all say that the subsequent lack of training and support when incidents arrives was appalling. They've all had to dip into their own pockets, as sub-postmasters have to make good this, and that just seems utterly bizarre. What sort of business practice is this that insists that they have to do that? Now, all of mine, as I said in the introduction, are outside of any scheme. We were hoping that this would give resolution, at least to those who were within the mediation, and point the way forward. And I refer the Minister to a debate when she made her statement on the 9th of July 2013, where I said that exact point to her. I said, my people are not in the scheme. They are not in any future thing. I now have three. I had two at the time. I now have three. I'm asking the Minister again today, where do they go? Let me just point out one of my constituents, just one of the three there. He was asked back in 2008 to repay over £5,000 to Post Office Limited as a result of discrepancies, of the like we've heard about today. He claims it was the fault of the Horizon computer system, but also lack of training, lack of support, lack of follow-up when difficulties arose, which I suspect the second site report, when it eventually comes out in March, April, will say is exactly what's happening. That is a pertinent point in this. It cannot just be the computer hardware. The lack of support, the lack of training, the downtime, the interruptions to that software are all pertinent things, and they don't seem to be taken into account. He'd spotted the error some time before. His daughter says he had somehow tried to adjust the matter by then repaying over £29,000 voluntarily to the post office. And then he was investigated. He was investigated, suspended from the role. The Post Office may be seeking full repayment, which, by the way, goes over £70,000, and criminal charges are not ruled out. He is a broken man, as described by his family. Not good enough. So I do ask the Minister, in this short contribution, to respond to these by saying, what help does she now give to those people who have been let down by the mediation scheme? But what does she do about what I suspect are hundreds of cases who never came forward initially and are now saying, we need justice as well?
Mr Murray.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Dorr. It's a great pleasure to serve when you are in the chair. And can I start by paying tribute to the member for North East Hampshire for bringing this debate to the House. I can't believe after 27 years of distinguished service to this place, this is his first adjournment debate, and probably better late than never given the content of what he's brought to us. And I wish him well after May when he goes on to other things. I'm incredibly disturbed by what we've heard this afternoon, Mrs Dorrs. I mean, I had been involved in this situation since the Minister gave the statement to the House last year, but we've heard some incredibly disturbing stories of people who've had their lives completely and utterly turned upside down through no fault of their own. And I was particularly concerned to hear from the member for North Durham, who will be a fantastic new chair for this particular group, about his constituent Tom Brown. 30 years service he's given to the Post Office, and he's lost his home, he's been declared bankrupt, he's now living with his son, he's lost over £250,000, and it's been described by the Post Office as a lifestyle choice and a lifestyle problem that he's perhaps achieved. And I hope that the Post Office, who will be watching this debate, will reflect on some of the stories that have been given by members today and try and do something about it. Because I did make the point quite clearly at the statement last year that we welcomed the fact the Post Office had recognised there was problems with the Horizon system, and it looked at that point as if they were going to do something significantly about it. But it appears since then that something hasn't been done about it. And I have in front of us, as the entire committee has, the letter from Sir Anthony Hooper, the chair of the working group, with on the back information about how these 150 cases have been progressing over the last few months. And it seems to me that whilst the information that's there seems incomplete, it would be useful to get information about particularly 7 cases that have been mediated. What were the conclusions of those cases? Was it found that the Horizon system was indeed incorrect? Was it found that the sub-postmaster was lacking in training or was lacking in any support? And the conclusions of the working group need to reflect back, perhaps to the Minister privately and to maybe the working group privately, as to what the information they now have with some of the cases that have been mediated in that fashion. I was also incredibly struck by the contribution by the member for North West Leicestershire and indeed Batley and Spen, who made the point that given the contracts that the Post Office have with their sub-postmasters, that they're completely and utterly responsible for any losses that they're incurred. So the carrot and stick approach of being able to steal from your own business, robbing Peter to pay Paul, well, actually in this particular instance, you're not robbing Peter to pay Paul at all, you're robbing Peter to pay Peter, in the sense that your contract means you're completely and utterly responsible for the losses that you incur. The second site report that's been referred to on a number of occasions did come up with some preliminary conclusions, and they're, I think, worth reflecting on in the context of the debate, because they found that there was no evidence that there were systemic, system-wide problems. Now, that in itself causes me a great deal of concern on the basis that we're hearing significant concerns consistently, and there may be some deeper problems with the system if it is indeed the case that the second site, who are the professionals in looking at these kind of investigations, can't find any significant problems. They have found 2 incidents where there were defects or bugs in the Horizon software, which gave rise to losses of some £9,000 in 76 branches. They did talk about individual postmaster experiences when they were reporting problems and the lack of support, the lack of a user forum, the lack of outreach and investigations that Post Office were able to supply when they found those particular problems. And they did think there was a problem perhaps with the trading period and the process that were happening throughout that crossover between transactional corrections. They did also talk about the lack of a suspense account option, which meant it was difficult during that particular process of transactional corrections being made, and were concerned that those weren't dealt with in a neutral manner. And that gives me concern, that kind of language that's been used from that particular report. But you also have to reflect on the fact that that interim report has been published with those types of conclusions, but we're continuing to hear the significant problems that some postmasters have had up and down the country. And we have to also reflect on the fact that the Post Office were encouraging postmasters to break the law in terms of the accounting by asking someone to allocate accounting to a different period in order to make up losses is indeed creative accountancy in itself, and that's something I think the Post Office need to fundamentally reflect on. We have over 144 members of this House who've supported this campaign. The member for North East Hampshire, who's brought this particular debate, has written to the Post Office and said that he has absolutely no confidence now that the Post Office Board is committed to finding a fair solution to this particular problem. I think that's something the Post Office have to reflect on, and the Board of the Post Office has to reflect on. But there's also a key role here for the Minister, and I do agree with the member for North Durham when he said that the Minister does have to try and take a hold of this particular situation and find a conclusion to it, because the more that it goes on, the more that we'll hear more of these stories of sub-postmasters up and down the country ending up in prison or declaring guilt for something they haven't done in order to prevent themselves having a custodial sentence. That's not the way that justice works in this country, and it's not the way that justice should be seen to be working in this country. I wonder if I could pose a number of questions to the Minister when she responds, and I'll sit down early and to have her time to respond to these, because I appreciate there has been a number of significant questions being posed by other members as well. But I wonder if I could firstly ask her response to the letter that's been given to the Post Office Limited by the Right Honourable Member for North East Hampshire in terms of the mediation of cases that were recommended by Mediation by Second Sight. Can she confirm that this is the case, and if so, what can the Minister do to find a solution to these particular cases? Secondly, can the Minister advise what discussions she has had with the Post Office on the specific point of cases refused mediation where the sub-postmaster involved has previously pleaded guilty to allegations of impropriety? I think this is something that should be looked at incredibly seriously, where people have either been given custodial sentences or criminal records or otherwise. Thirdly, will the Minister take urgent action to not only try and resolve the cases that are still outstanding, and we see that from the Chair of the Working Group's letter today, but also some of the cases from honourable members that have arisen since the closing date of the particular mediation scheme that was put in place. Fourthly, if the Minister will address the loss of confidence in the system from the GFSA to the Post Office, highlighted in the letter by the honourable member for North East Hampshire. Fifthly, what discussions has she had with the Post Office Limited and the prosecution services with regards to the prosecution of sub-postmasters, and whether or not she would bring a statement back to this House on the process that would be happening in that particular area, and whether or not there are any concerns or any further concerns that the Government have with regards not just the Post Office Limited's handling of this particular issue, but with the ongoing process with the Horizon system. We've heard some horrendous worst-case scenarios, Mrs Doris, by honourable members today, and I think we need to be reflecting on what they have been saying to us, and we have to plead with the Minister to really get hold of this particular issue, answer the concerns of not just members, but do justice to the many hard-working sub-postmasters up and down the country who feel that they no longer have confidence that these issues are being dealt with correctly, and to make sure that these issues don't reoccur again.
Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Dorries. And I first of all congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for North East Hampshire, for securing this debate on the review and mediation scheme relating to Post Office Limited and Horizon. And I know that he's set out his concerns very clearly and very eloquently, and he cares passionately about this subject and has, over a long period of time, worked tirelessly on this, as have many other honourable members who are here today, and I appreciate them taking forward the concerns of their constituents quite understandably on this issue. Obviously, the debate we're having today follows on from the statement in the House in July 2013 and the important foundations and commitments that were made at that point. I've listened very carefully to the concerns raised by honourable members today and recognise the real and genuine distressing situations that have been put forward and the concerns that honourable members understandably have for their constituents. Obviously, in wanting to respond as thoroughly and fully as possible to the debate today, I was keen to get views on how the scheme was going from the working party themselves, and so I contacted the chair of the working party, and the letter which I received back from Sir Anthony Hooper, the chair of the working group, I have made sure I circulated to honourable members who are here in the debate. I placed it yesterday in the library of the House, but appreciating that not everybody would have noticed that that had happened, I thought it would be helpful to bring copies along to the debate today. Sir Anthony Hooper, who of course is a Court of Appeal judge, and when he was appointed as chair of the working group, it was actually on the suggestion of the Justice for Subpostmasters Alliance, who had put forward that name, and his appointment was welcomed by many honourable members, including my honourable friend from North East Hampshire, who I understand still has confidence in the role of Sir Anthony Hooper as chair of the working party. He has set out very clearly, Sir Anthony Hooper, the confidentiality requirements, and as such was not able to have a discussion, and said that there was limited information that he could give. This wasn't Post Office Limited, as the honourable gentleman from North Durham suggested, but the Court of Appeal judge. But what he has provided is numbers of the cases in terms of where they are at in terms of the progress that has been made. So far, the working group, there have been 150 applications to the scheme, 10 cases resolved before actually the scheme started. 4 applications were just rejected outright, and a couple have been resolved during investigation. And the rest of the cases are sort of working through the scheme at different points in the timeline. But so far, 24 cases have been recommended for mediation by the working group, of which only 2 have not actually gone to mediation because the Post Office has not been happy to mediate. And a general principle, I will give way just after the next sentence or two. I understand the concerns raised by honourable members on this issue, but I would point out that 2 out of 24 is nothing like the figure of 90% that's been put forward. And it is a basic principle of mediation that both parties do agree to it in a voluntary way, so that that can be entered into in the proper constructive spirit. So I don't know that I will give way to the honourable gentleman first. So I will tally up the interventions. But I think there would be no point in entering a mediation if, in that case, one of the parties was absolutely adamant that it could not reach any possible positive outcome. But it is the case that most of the cases that have been recommended for mediation are indeed going forward to mediation. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman from Batley and Spen.
I'm grateful. Is the Minister then happy that the mediation process started on one basis, is now being interpreted on a completely different one by the Post Office, which will mean that the vast majority of these cases listed here as going through the process will actually be excluded and never get to mediation? Are you happy about that as the Minister?
Well, I don't accept the premise of the question. So the scheme was set up, and it was agreed that any case could apply to the scheme, even cases where the individual had pleaded guilty to a conviction and to a charge. And then the working group, which is made up of the Justice for Subpostmasters Alliance, or through Second Sight, and the Post Office, but also with the chair of the working group, Sir Anthony Hooper. They will then consider the report from Second Sight about whether a case should go forward to mediation, and then as a result of that process, the cases then go forward to mediation. But it was never anticipated that that every single case would go to mediation. There is that point at which the working group considers it. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman for North West Leicestershire first.
I thank the Minister. I do not know what the Post have been saying to the Minister, but I think the Post have been saying a different story to the members, MPs of the working group. Is the Minister aware that one of the criteria for refusing mediation, and we've heard examples where people have lost everything in their life, is because the claims, the Post Office are claiming that the claim by the sub-postmaster for compensation is too high, i.e. they've suffered a huge loss. So they're using that as a criteria for excluding them from mediation because their claim is too large, because they've lost too much.
Minister.
Well, as I say, we're only talking at present about 2 cases where this has actually happened, because there's only 2 cases where the Post Office has refused to mediate. So I don't know whether there is some degree of confusion, but that is very clearly what Sir Anthony Hooper, who is the independent chair of the working group, has provided that information, and if honourable members wish to challenge that, I will happily go back to Sir Anthony Hooper about the information that has been provided. I have to work on the basis that Court of Appeal judge is providing me with accurate information. I hope honourable members will appreciate that. Give way to my own friend. Right, honourable friend.
James Arbuthnot.
Just to be clear, I have not lost faith in Sir Anthony Hooper as the chair of that working group, but I have never said that 90% of the cases have been rejected. I have said that it is the Post Office that is recently arguing that 90% of the cases should be rejected. And that is where the breach of faith and the lack of straightforward dealing comes.
And this is where it is slightly difficult territory, because the working group discussions are confidential. I don't go to those discussions. I don't know what's said in those discussions, and I can't find out what's been said in those discussions. And indeed, every party involved in those discussions is bound by that confidentiality. So I don't know whether the information that the Right Honourable Gentleman mentions is in fact accurate. But that said, what I would point to is the information that we do have from Sir Anthony Hooper is that even if what he says is true, and that Post Office have argued for some of these cases not to be mediated, nonetheless they have gone into mediation on those cases. So in a sense it is a slightly academic point, though I do understand the concern behind it from honourable members. And I also take on board very much and take seriously the comments made by more than one honourable member about the attitude of senior staff from Post Office Limited to groups of MPs about this issue. I'll give way to honourable friend.
Looking beyond the issue of mediation, it's very clear from what we've heard in today's debate that a large number of people have had their lives ruined because they adopted accounting practices on the basis of advice given to them by the Post Office. In other words, as I said in the intervention, the Post Office itself was counselling or procuring false accounting. Has my honourable friend considered referring that matter to the prosecuting authorities?
Well, he's right to recognise that this is a very serious accusation, and it is one that I do believe, if true, would be incredibly serious. It's very difficult to know if that is the case, and that's why full investigation is needed. And I mean, the honourable gentleman from North Durham made a clear challenge, and I think a fair one, in terms of trying to make sure we get some action and resolution on this issue. I suppose the point I would push back is to say that many of these cases are incredibly complex, understandably so, because you're dealing with systems and many transactions. And in order to do something, what they require is independent investigation that is done thoroughly and forensically. And so if, in terms of what is... I'm going to finish this point, if honourable members will allow me. And therefore, if he says do something, well, what I would, in that scenario, normally propose doing is getting a team of forensic accountants to go through every scenario, for that to be looked at by somebody independent, such as a former Court of Appeal judge. And therefore, that system that we have in place to look at these cases, and then they can actually produce reports on it, or indeed, if the particular cases can be mediated, then that is an ideal solution. And if during the course of that mediation and those investigations, any information comes to light that suggests that any of the convictions that have currently happened are unsafe, there is a legal duty on that information to be disclosed to the individuals who were convicted, and indeed to their legal representation. So I fail to see how action can be taken without properly looking in detail at every single one of these cases, exactly through the kind of scheme that we have actually set up. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman for Ennis Lawn, who haven't given way to you.
Involved in the mediation, but can she tell senior members of the Post Office that they need to look at some of the accusations made against their staff specifically for giving certain information to people who have ended up in court and in jail?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a very serious accusation, and there have been many issues raised in the debate today and in some of the correspondence, which I do think are serious issues that Post Office Limited need to be looking at and making sure they are responding to, and indeed whether that's about reassuring themselves that these things perhaps didn't occur, or whether that's looking into also whether that was the case, and if so, taking appropriate action. I don't think for a second that the issues raised today are ones which we take lightly. I just caution against some kind of swift and easy magic solution. We have to look at the details, we have to look at the facts, it has to be done forensically, and that's why Second Sight, the team of forensic accountants have been employed, and that's why we have somebody of the calibre of Sir Anthony Hooper to oversee the process. I'll give way, but the time is very short.
Minister quite rightly places great store by the involvement of Second Sight.